Okay, so yeah, good morning, everyone. I'd like to greet all the panelists here and all attendees. We see our Dean, Dr. Eko, Professor Mamdu, um, Muzuddin, Ahmad Naufa, Usman, and of course our distinguished guests, Professor Faff and Professor Law. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for attending our research workshop, the series of research workshop. And today, I think the main topic for the morning session would be enhancing the possibility of publishing world-class journals, world-class papers in world-class journals. And we're privileged this morning to have Robert Faff, the first distinguished guest from the University of Queensland. So let me read quickly his resume. Robert Faff is a professor of finance and formerly director of research at the UQ, University of Queensland Business School, and is highly reputed in publishing finance and maybe an investment journals. Has secured 14 Australian Research Council grants exceeding $4 million, and has published more than 310 refereed journals or refereed papers in journals. So again, Robert Faff, he was with us, I think, last week or about 2 weeks ago. And the second session we'll have Professor Law, maybe at 10 a.m. But we'll start with Professor Robert Faff, publishing well-respected finance journals. And I think, again, this would be a great opportunity for all the participants. If you have questions or specific questions or maybe some clarifications that you want to ask from Robert or Professor Law, you can write down on the chat room, or maybe later I can give you an opportunity to speak and unmute yourself, and we'll see how it works. But for now, I'll hand in the time to Professor Robert Faff. I mean, if you want to have an hour or maybe less than that, that would be fine. And afterward, we'll have a Q&A session with all the participants. Okay, so please, Robert, time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Eddy, and thank you for the very kind opening remarks. I am very pleased to join again and try and help give some insights into my experience of publishing. What I bring, probably the only thing I bring is experience and some grey hair. Apart from that, I don't bring too much, because I know in the audience and in academia generally, there are a lot of very, very able, very capable, very smart, very intelligent people, and everyone has the ability and the potential to succeed, and to succeed very well. But it takes time, and there are often some little tricks, some little snags, some things that can trip us up. So when one survives in any area, I think that's the best thing that they can bring to others who are coming through. Some insights into what lies ahead and how to be more efficient. Now, I have some slides, and I'm going to share my screen, and these are slides that I've used many times for a PhD course that I run. Now, they are about publishing, but they're also about, or at least the title, and we'll see the title. It's about the examination process, or at least what examiners are looking for. So hopefully I've shared the right screen, and you can see, and I have the screen over here, so I'll occasionally look that way, although I should be clever and find something that will have right straight ahead. So what are examiners, editors and reviewers looking for? It seems to me this is quite close to the theme that you presented to me. I've added in examiners, but my view here is, and I imagine there are a number in the audience that are doing their PhD. I don't know how many, but I suspect there will be some. And for a PhD student, the examination process is obviously very critical and very, very daunting and worrying. But the things that you should aim for to convince an examiner are exactly the things, in my view, exactly the things that you aim for to try and get published. And if you can publish in your work in highly reputed international journals, if you're able to do that, or potentially to do that, and you strive to do that with your work, then the examiners will be very pleased with your thesis. So that's why I bracket them all. But essentially, I am going to talk about the publication process. And it will be general advice, but the way in which to interpret this general advice is if you really and truly want to aim for highly respected international journals, then the advice that I give, you just need to amplify. If it seems like I'm giving a very simple and low-level message, in order for it to be at that higher level, you just need to amplify it. In other words, the simple message can always be scaled up so that the challenge for you is greater than maybe the message I'm giving you. And I'll try and give you examples of this as we proceed. So one of the things I'll refer the audience to, it's not what I'd say mandatory reading, but if you're interested in reading some of the tips that I've got here, there is a paper on the SSRN. It's very easy to access. It's called Essential Tips on Refereeing for Academic Journals. And this, hopefully you can see why this is relevant. Everyone here wants to write and create a great paper that will be accepted at a journal. Well, the flip side of that is refereeing. So if you see the tips on refereeing, this should give you some clues and some helpful advice in terms of how to construct a paper that will do the job. Now, a lot of what I will tell you in my talk, I think, will dovetail quite neatly with the second part of today's session, which, as I understand it, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting it, will be more around the tools and the econometrics and what you need to do, the skills you need to have around executing some analysis that you would then write up and publish. So I will make some general references to this, and it's clearly important in terms of getting published, but the more specific detail of that I would anticipate you will get in the second session. So the first thing I want to talk about, and we don't need to dwell on this, but I suspect there'll be a variety of people in the audience. Some will be very experienced, and what I'm about to tell you, you know inside out. Those that are very inexperienced and very new to publications and trying to get work into journals, then what I'm about to set out for you, I think, will be quite helpful in terms of just framing your thinking and your mind to what I will be assuming for all the audience. And it's basically the journal review process. And so how does publication work, and how do we get our work into print? Now, I guess a naive view would be that it's a very simple process. It can be very quick, and you know, it could be, you might have a view that all you need to do is write something up, send it to an editor. The editor will look at it and say, do I like it? Oh, I love it. and they'll come back, they'll write back to you and say, we'd love to publish your work, or I'm not so sure I like it, no, sorry. Now, it's not like that at all, and I know most of the audience will understand this, but there are some journals that sort of behave a bit like that, and they're ones to avoid. So the first little message I'd have for you, particularly novice researchers, is that the old saying, if it sounds too good to be true, then it is. It is too good to be true. And there are journals and many journals, or almost pretend journals, that are springing up almost daily. And these are what we call predatory journals, online predatory journals. And they're looking for those that don't understand how the game works, those that are vulnerable, and typically those that are very new and fresh to publication. And they have a particular business model in mind, which is, you have some money, we want to get it off you, okay? They want to steal your money. And the way that a lot of these journals will do this, these online predatory journals, is to make you think that they're a legitimate journal. Now, the problem and the trick is, there are a number of online journals that are totally legitimate and are good publication venues. But what the predatory journals are doing is trying to pretend they're one of these quality journals. And their model basically is to solicit your work from you. So you'll get an email from nowhere. You've never heard of this journal before. And they will say something very complimentary to you, like, dear so-and-so, I get these all the time, and I imagine many in the audience do, So I will get, dear Professor Faff, we recently came across your paper, and they'll have identified a paper that I've got, either a working paper, it could be published, and for me, there's many of them to choose from, so that they can find these easily. And they'll say, we were impressed by your paper. This is one of the best papers we've ever seen. And we love to publish this paper or a paper like it in our journal. And they'll then say, and we review these papers, but we can promise you a very, very quick turnaround. And this is one of the telltale signs. They might say, we can give you a review in 7 days or something like that. Now, that doesn't happen. In normal journals, in traditional journals, in good international journals, it takes usually months, many months, and sometimes, and sadly sometimes, it can take close to a year just to get a first review. Now, I think there have been improvements in turnaround times, but to think you could get a review in 7 days or something like that is fantasy. And to me, it would indicate there's something wrong. Now, that in combination with the promise or the promise of that there's no submission fee, but there's a publication fee. So the business model is basically to find vulnerable researchers, young researchers, get them to submit their paper. They accept your paper very quickly, and then you have to pay a fee. And it could be any amount. It could be the equivalent of 500 US or 500 euros or something of that nature. Now, because it's online, there's very few overheads for these so-called journals. They can do this very cheaply. They charge you a fee. Your paper might be published online, who knows? And they just rake in the money. And the academic community, your academic community will not respect that journal unless it is a legitimate journal that's doing a proper process. But the ones I'm talking about, they're not respected. And if you have that as a publication on your CV, it will be a very bad sign. It will be a very bad sign indeed. So the first tip I'm giving you on the rule that you should follow is, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. And if you're unsure, get advice, seek advice from a trusted colleague or mentor or supervisor or collaborator. And if they indicate to you, no, it's legitimate, then you might think about it. If not, if they say, I've never heard of the journal, this is bad, keep away. Now, I'm going to have some more slides a little later on that talk about the choice of journal, because thinking about a target journal early is important, and thinking about potential journals that you could target is important. One of the reasons that you should think about more than one journal is it's very likely that you will not be accepted at your first journal. Now, I've had colleagues in the past, I remember years ago, I had a junior colleague. He came into my office. He was really excited. He said, I've just had a paper accepted at Journal X, and I think it was an okay journal. And then he said, and this was the thing that he was proud of, he said, and I can't remember the number, I think he said, that's my 10th accepted paper. And he said, I've never been rejected. He said, I've never been rejected. And I was quite shocked, because I thought, never been rejected. How can this be? You know, there's a very small chance that you've got the journal right every time, and they're high quality journals every time, but that's almost zero. There's almost zero chance that you've perfected it. So what I told him, and I had to be very careful about this, but I said, I think there's a problem here. And he was puzzled because he thought, I'm so successful, I've never been rejected. And I said, you have to be rejected, at least sometime. And the reason is, it's very likely that you are aiming too low. So what we have to do, and over our careers, we have to balance being ambitious and being cautious. And if we're too cautious, if we're too restrictive in the journals we choose, then we will get less rejections. But there's a very high correlation. It's not a perfect correlation. There is a very high correlation between the rate of rejection and the quality of the journal. So other things equal, the higher the quality of the journal, the higher is its rejection rate. Not a perfect correlation. So if you accept that proposition, then you should understand that if someone has 10 publications and never had a rejection, then there's a problem, because it's an imperfect process. So there are possibilities of getting accepted at better journals, and that's what we need to strive for. We need to choose journals that are relevant to us, that we care about, but other things equal, we should strive for higher quality journals relative to lower quality journals in our field. And in order to do that as a sustainable and long-term exercise, we need to experience rejection. And we learn from rejections. We get feedback that will help us improve our research. So if I move to the first slide, and I won't dwell on this too much now, but I just wanted to, particularly for the very novice and new researchers out there that maybe have never submitted a paper to a journal yet, or have had very limited experience. It's a long process. It's a scary process. It's a daunting process. And in terms of the first round, the most likely outcome is reject. It's very likely. That is not a very nice prospect, but it's one that we have to accept. Now, the middle outcome here, an R&R, is a revise and resubmit. Now, it's unlikely, but it's really realistically, that's what we hope to get in our after our first submission. And I've already indicated it will take several months. Even highly efficient journals, it will take several months. And there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, one is referees have to do a job. Peer reviewers have to take time to read your work, understand your work, critique your work, think about that critique, write the critique, and process the review. And many journals, this will be totally voluntary and a free service. Now, some journals will pay a nominal amount to their reviewers. The journal that I referee, the Pacific-Basin Finance Journal, we have a model where we do pay our referees $100 US for an on-time review. So there is some incentive for the reviewers to deliver a review in 42 days, okay, 6 weeks. So for my journal, you might say, oh, that's great, we should get a review in 6 weeks' time. Well, it's much more complicated than that. Quite often, I don't find a reviewer straight away. So there will be time taken in trying to find a reviewer qualified and willing to do the job. And sometimes that could take several weeks. But even prior to that, from the submission time to the time that I see a paper, there will be some degree of lag. It's just the wheels of motion in terms of the administrative processes. Even online, a paper might need a week or so before I get to see it as the editor. So revise and resubmit, or all of these decisions will take some time. We can see over on the right-hand side at the top is what you might have thought is your goal in the first round of submission. But in a perverse and strange way, getting accepted immediately is not your goal. And it does sound perverse, So here I am telling you, submit a paper to a journal and don't expect and don't have a goal of getting it accepted straight away. And hopefully you understand why I'm saying that. High quality journals do not accept your paper straight away. Okay, you might have a fantastic paper, but reviewers will always find something. Part of the reason is they know that's their job. Another part of the reason is this is somewhat uncertain. There are different perspectives. There are different views. There is no unanimous way of doing research. Now, in the session that will follow mine, I'm sure you will get advice around the choice of different econometric techniques, different tools, different methods. And reviewers come from different backgrounds. They've had different training. They've done their own research. There will be an overlap in terms of views, but there will never be a strong consensus. And so there will always be a report at a good journal that at a minimum says a minor revise and resubmit. Now that would be absolutely fantastic news. Okay, a minor revise and resubmit, very unlikely on the first round, particularly at a high quality journal. But if we can get that as our outcome, that is time for celebration. Now there's an even better outcome than that, a conditional accept, where the referee really likes your paper, the editor really likes it, but they just want some minor things changed. Again, highly unlikely for you in a first round. So you're more likely to get a revise and resubmit, and or most likely, very likely, a reject. So what is the hardest thing about getting research published? Well, we could, I think we're going to talk about many of these things in some degree of detail, but let me tell you in a general sense one thing which is half serious and half humorous, and that is you need to get the editor to care about your research. Now, it's nothing personal, all right? If you get rejected, whenever we get rejected, the temptation is to think it's very personal, okay? You might think the referee or the editor, they don't like me, they hate me. The referee or the editor, they don't like my family, they hate my family. The referee or the editor, they don't like where I come from. All of these negative emotions will bubble in your head. And almost all the time, they're wrong. Now, sometimes they might be right. Rarely they might be right. Impossible to prove, almost impossible to prove. So you need to take the view that it's not personal. We can take it personally for a little bit, I think, as therapy. For me, I always think, well, I'll have a bad weekend. I'll say all these horrible things about the editor and the referee, and then on Monday, it's a new week, and I have to push that aside. But we do need the editor to care, not in terms of us personally, but that they have some attraction, or they find appealing the paper that we've written. Now, I've read a lot of papers, I've reviewed a lot of papers, and the ones that I hate, not because I hate the person, but the ones that I hate are the papers that are written in a very bad way, in a very dry way, in a very boring way, in a very lengthy way. You name it. There are so many ways that you can make an editor not care, or a referee not care. And one of the big mistakes we make, and this is more about writing, but I think it's about the whole package of doing research. We do the research and we write the research up for our own pleasure. And that is often a mistake, all right? Because think of some of the things that we might be tempted to do if we're writing for ourselves. Well, I can tell you a couple of related ones. If I'm writing for myself, I will happily write page after page after page after page. And I will hate, if I'm doing this for myself, I will hate to use delete. The delete button on the computer will have a lock on it. Do not use. No backspace if I'm writing for myself. Because we become emotionally attached to every word that we write. It's human nature. It's absolutely human nature. And if we write for ourselves and we don't think about who we're really writing for, which is an audience, it's readers. Initially, it's an editor and a referee. And we need to write in a way that's engaging, that's appealing, that makes whoever reads it want to care about it and go, this is really interesting. I can't wait to read the next page. So it starts, where does it start? It starts with the title, it starts with the abstract, and it starts with the introduction. So if you want a few tips, it's get into the long-term habit of spending a disproportionate amount of time on those parts of your paper. So what do I mean by that? So if you imagine you'd set yourself a budget of time, and I'm just making this up now, it's for illustrative purposes. Don't take this as a literal piece of advice. So imagine you set yourself 100 hours. Okay, most people will say, wow, you can't do anything in 100 hours. You need much more. But 100 it's a nice number to think about. So you've got a 100-hour budget for writing a paper. What I mean by devote a disproportionate amount of time to the front matter, the title, the abstract, the introduction, is if you think think of it as the number of words. And let's say that an average paper, those items are less than 10% of the words. So a proportionate amount of time would be, in terms of the number of words, 10% maybe of the time, 10 hours of 100 hours. My advice to you is to amp that up, to budget for a disproportionate amount of your time to think about what is a catchy title, what is an informative and catchy abstract, how am I going to hook the reader in the introduction. So if there's 100 hours, less than 10% of the words are in those sections. For example, devote 20 hours to them. And it's not the first 20 hours. This would be another mistake a novice researcher would make. Thinking very linearly. So you think of a paper, you would think, well, the way someone would read it is start from the top and go through, and like you read a novel. Okay? Academic work is inverts, throws upside down the way that we deal with reading novels. Okay, you never want to read the last page of a novel first. The mystery novel, right? The fiction. You never want to read the last page. Why? Because you found out that the butler did it. All right? And that ruins it. You don't want to read the novel anymore because you know the answer to the mystery. Well, with academic work, it's totally the other way around. Readers want to know who did it as quickly as possible. So this means that in terms of the way we go about writing and constructing, it should be non-linear. And so when I say devote 20 of the 100 hours to the introduction, just because someone might read that first doesn't mean that you write it first. In fact, it's probably all upside down. You do most of the writing of those pieces at the end. So most of the 20 hours comes at the end. And one of the reasons, but it's not the only one, the logic is you don't know for sure what your paper's about until you're near the end. This is the nature of research. So you start off heading in a direction and there are twists and turns. It's non-linear. So you start at point A, you're heading for point B, and you end up at point C. Well, you start at point A, you've got a straight line in mind to get to point B. You actually get to point B, but it's nowhere near straight. So there are all sorts of things like that you need to take into consideration in terms of the challenge of getting your work published and coming up with a product not only executing a great piece of research, but a final product in terms of how you've word crafted the writing so it does it justice. And it all comes back to, if you do not get the editor to care, you're probably lost already. Okay, as an editor, so my journal, I have, it looks like I'm tracking for 750 new submissions this calendar year. We're already close to 600 for Pacific-Basin this calendar year. So there's a lot of flow, and that ignores having resubmissions come through that I've got to deal with. But it's the new submissions that will give me the headache, because I've got to think of, who am I going to ask to referee this? I want someone suitably qualified that I think has the capacity and willingness to do it. And if I am unsure, so I've got a scarcity of resources. The resources are the reviewers. So more and more, what I'm describing to you, all editors are facing. And the really high quality journals, so super, tier 1 journals, getting thousands of submissions, they've got a real constraint on resources. So what do editors do, including myself? Well, we desk reject. Okay, what this means is there are reasons, and I'll tell you some of these very shortly, of why we don't even send a paper out for review, because we want to shield our valuable resources. I probably desk reject 20% of papers submitted. So 700 papers, 20%, 140 a year. That's a lot of rejections where you don't even get a referee's report. So why would that happen? Well, a lot of it will be because when I look at the paper, I just think it's not going to work. I don't, it's not I don't care about the person. It's nothing personal. It's just the care factor is too low. Now, usually that will be combined with a poor fit. Okay, all journals will have their scope. And if you're not aware and you don't read the journal webpage and you don't look at some papers in a journal, and you might think to yourself, oh, don't tell us such rubbish. Of course we would do that. Well, let me tell you something. I have a lot of anecdotal evidence that submitters to my journal, a good portion, a significant minority, I have anecdotal evidence they have never read one article from my journal. I have anecdotal evidence that they've not even looked at the scope of my journal. Let me give you a quick abstract example. So the Pacific-Basin Finance Journal prides itself in trying to be the port of first call for papers, high quality papers that use Asia Pacific or Pacific Basin data. Now, we do something that on the face of it seems quite strange. So we modify this slightly. We exclude the US. Okay? And I had an editor who I desk rejected recently came back to me and said, the last time I looked at the map, the United States of America was on the Pacific Rim. But they had a little smiley face. So we exclude the US, or at least papers that exclusively use US data. We want to be the port of call for all non-US Asia Pacific high quality work. Now, one of the reasons we do the exclusion is it then focuses attention on a lot of good research that finds it difficult to get published. The other thing it does is to say, hey, the trend has been growing that everyone wants to do research using US data. And all the journals are receptive to that, or most. So we sort of feel like if you come to our journal, already you've probably had some bad news at several other journals. And while there might still be good US studies that are publishable in journals similar quality to Pacific-Basin, we don't want to be seen as the waste paper basket for these types of study. Now that's a little bit harsh, that's probably very harsh, but we have good reason for why we do not want US studies. So in combination with a poorly crafted or poorly written paper, you're going to get a desk reject from me. And other journals will have their reasons for desk reject, but probably the common general one is poor fit. And if you want to figure out what a journal is after, read the main page where it'll state we are particularly interested in these types of papers, and then scan some of the recent issues of the journal, and you'll get a good feel for that. So the second hardest thing is to get referees to care, and it's the same sort of thing as I've already talked about, but now the referees are an agent for the editor. They're trying to do a good job for the editor, but basically if they find a paper, you know, very boring, very badly written, you name it, they're not going to care. Now, let me give you a piece of advice which I think is going to be valuable to you, but it's going to be scary. It's going to be a little off-putting, but I could not tell you and save you some concern, but I think I want to tell you. Here's how you should model your typical referee in terms of the way they're going to view the job. Your typical referee will come to your paper before they've even opened it and read one word. Their mindset will be, I think I'm going to reject. I think I'm going to reject this paper. All right? Now, a lot of referees will literally have that in their brain. It'll be in the conscious part of their brain. I would put to you, almost all other referees will have it in the subconscious part of their brain. They won't actually realise it, but the mindset and the way they go about the job, it's as if they are planning to reject, and it's sort of then like, well, as an author, what you've got to do very quickly is try and knock that thought out of their brain. All right? So you've got to have early in the paper some things that will make them, you know, go, wow, I can't believe it. This is a good paper. All right? And so you need to break that mindset. You absolutely need to break that mindset. Well, editors and referees are looking for a lot. We can think about the editor's objectives. I'm not going to dwell on that. I want to go to a few more specifics now. I know I'm sort of going slow, but there'll be time for questions here very shortly. So how can we convince editors to care? Well, for those of you that attended the session I did a week or two ago, this slide will look familiar. I'm not going to dwell on this much at all, although I know for sure there are going to be a number of you that you missed out. You absolutely missed out on a fantastic talk. And the talk was about how to pitch your research. Now, it seems to me if I don't mention that in the context of how to publish in quality journals, there's something wrong. Because why wouldn't it make sense that a lot of the elements of how you would set up your strategy for doing good research, why wouldn't they be relevant to getting your paper published? It beggars belief that I wouldn't have that link. So for the benefit of those that didn't attend the session, and for those that did, just to remind you that a big, or to stress, a big part of my tip and advice to you would be, don't forget this framework. It's not only something that will help you plan your research, it's going to be something that should guide you in terms of, as you go through the process of doing your research, these things are important. So I've already mentioned the title. You can lose a reader very early on and never get them back, a referee, because you have a very bad title. Good example of a really bad title is one that is many lines long and has all these things in it. All looks very complicated. Tell you what I do when I'm refereeing for a journal and I see a title like that. That thought of, I think I'm going to reject, suddenly comes from my subconscious to my conscious. And so then I'm still trying to have an open mind. So it's sort of like, all right, I better see some things, some good things really quickly to knock that thought out. So can the author convince me to move from reject to a revise and resubmit? So the things I'll be looking for is, well, what's the research question? Do I think it's a good choice of a research question? What are the key papers that are really these authors are framing their work around? And I'm looking for recent work. And if I see that there's some old papers that they're building their work on, the negative thought comes into my mind, because I can only think of bad reasons for this, all bad reasons. What's the motivation? So a number of my referees reports will have, and I like to have little titles to the points that I'm making. And so the little titles of the points will often have some of, using, motivation. I'm not convinced by your motivation. It's not compelling. Or data. There's often things around data. The sampling is not representative of the population. Construct validity. So the constructs or the proxies that are being chosen, they need to be compelling counterparts to the underlying theoretical variables. All right? The idea, what's the hypothesis, the prediction, and so on. I often have reports that say, what's new? So what's truly new here? And I'll say some more about that one a little later on. Why is it important? So what? And contribution. I mean, that's the one that a lot of referees use and probably abuse and misuse, because it's one of the easiest ones to bring out, particularly for the big journals. There'll be the referee will make some comment about, unfortunately, my reading of this paper indicates that what's being presented is not only not very new, but and they'll say something like, it doesn't reach the lofty standards required for this journal. And sometimes they might even say, look, I don't have a big problem with this paper, but for this journal, you just don't get over the threshold. You don't get over the threshold. So all of these things, I think, are very important and very essential for you in terms of trying to figure out how to get your paper into a really good journal. Now, for those that sadly missed my presentation last week, I think the organisers have, I think you recorded the session. So if I'm right there'll be a recorded session that you can get access to. If I'm wrong there, what you should do if you want to know more about this is go to the SSRN, the Social Sciences Research Network, SSRN. And in fact, simple way, Google SSRN, and then a space and my name, Faff, Faff. If you do that, Google, the very top item I can almost guarantee it, will be the paper on pitching research. Do yourself a favour, access that paper. You'll learn a lot that not only helps you plan your research, but helps you think about some really important ingredients and items that you need to have in your paper in terms of the write-up, in terms of the execution, that will improve your chances for publication. Okay, SSRN, it's free to download. Well, I did say I was going to talk about target journal. I've sort of made a few general comments that are relevant to this. Now, some time ago, I found a blog, this blog is quite worth a look for you. So it's the address is at the top of this slide. So @Write for Research. There are several of these, quite a number actually, that you'll find some really helpful advice from. Now, this particular blog was about, they described the 31 things to consider when choosing which journal to submit your paper to. And and I will make these slides available later, so you could if you could hover over that and click it. I'm not going to do it. You could actually find the blog entry itself. Now, I'm not going to go through all the 31. I just want to cherry pick and show you some thinking. Here, they classify under 5 headings. So scope or fit, and I've talked a bit about that, so we probably won't need to say too much on that one. The review process, well, I talked a bit about that as well. Open or closed access, I've actually talked about that. Fit, it's probably a little different from scope, but and then dissemination and impact. So this slide just is a screenshot of, they tabulate against all these criteria what the criteria is. So, the age of the journal or the publication history, what the key question is, and then a best answer. So I let you look at that yourselves if you're interested. I'll just quickly go over and cherry pick some of these things. So in terms of scope, actually, I think we pretty much talked enough on scope. In terms of review process, different journals operate under different models. So you can have single blind, double blind, or triple blind. Now, most journals will do what you would call a double blind. And what this means is you as the author do not know who the reviewer is, so that's anonymous. And the referees don't know who the authors are, so that's anonymous. Now, in the current, given the current technology, the referee can usually have a good chance of figuring out who you are as an author. Why is that? Well, you're very likely to have presented the paper at a conference, and a lot of those conference materials are available. You can Google them pretty quickly, or you might even put it up on SSRN. It might be officially double blind, but it can easily be single blind. I've talked about time from submission to decision, and for good journals, you have to think in terms of months, not days, not weeks. The rejection rates are typically very high. For the very highest quality journals, rejection rates are way under 5%. So 100 papers come in, 95 papers rejected. And when you get a reject, it's bye-bye, you cannot come back with that paper again. Now, there is some variation in terms of the number of reviewers. And this one in green I've actually added in as my own contribution or addition to the review process. My journal, for various reasons, including economy, because I pay the referees, well, I don't pay them personally, Elsevier pays them. So there's a budget that needs to be met, as well as reviewer resources. We rely on just one referee. Now, that is not ideal, but in terms of taking into account all of the considerations, it's the way we operate. A number of journals will do 2 referees, some will do 3 referees. What I would suggest, but it's not a hard and fast rule, if you're comparing journals that you think I could target this one, target journal A or journal B, you might be tempted to go with a journal that has fewer referees. At least avoid journals that have 3 or more referees. Just a nightmare. Referees never agree with each other. And as an author, if you get a revise and resubmit, the headache of trying to figure out how you respond to referees that are telling you opposite things is not enjoyable, right? It's quite problematic. Now, I'm sure as I go through some of these things now, you might have some questions that come to mind. If you do have questions, we'll have a break shortly to hear some of those questions, but type them into the chat and we can pick up on those questions very shortly. Well, I've already talked about avoid predatory open access journals, so we'll skip on. I've talked about fit as being important, so basically you want to find a journal for which your paper will fit. And I've already told you, I will desk reject you if you have an exclusively US sample. I'll also desk reject you, these are the 2 big ones for me, if you send me an accounting paper. All right. Now, let me give you probably the most popular accounting topic that I desk reject on, and I deem it to be accounting, and I think it's reasonable, is earnings management. All right. For some reason, there's a lot of, and they're usually accounting researchers actually, and I don't have anything against accounting researchers. I'm a trained accountant. I've published accounting research, but I've found accounting journals. Okay, Pacific-Basin Finance Journal does not have as its central scope accounting papers. All right, so earnings management is one that I see as an accounting one. Now, one that's in a grey area, I have desk rejected some that look at price crash risk. All right. And my view is that the history of this stream of research, where you look at crash risk for individual stocks, it's basically borne by the accounting literature. There are some angles on this that I think could be seen as finance enough, but essentially the message I'm saying to you is think carefully about your target journal and don't just assume the journal will be interested in your paper. It could well be very uninterested to the point it will give you a desk reject. Now, one I've got in green here is something I've added in, and that is, and it's relevant to fit. It's basically, you've got to see your paper as joining in on a conversation, a vibrant and active research conversation. As an editor, that's what I want to see. I want to see papers that come in that naturally are linking to either existing work that we've already published or that similar journals have already published. And it's recent, all right? It's not a dead area. No journal editor wants to bring in a paper and publish it in an area that looks like it died 10 years ago. So what are the telltale signs? You won't be able to find papers that have been published recently either in the journal you're targeting or in any journal. So be aware of that. Now, the one counter to that is at some points in time, an editor might take the view, oh my gosh, not another paper in this field. So sometimes there's like a saturation point. And the saturation threshold in the really big journals is low. You know, some journals either state, or the editors state, or they act as if as soon as we have one paper on this research question, that is enough. They don't want any more, or they don't want too many more. So think of the saturation factor. It will be a higher threshold in lower quality journals and a lower threshold in higher quality journals. In terms of dissemination and impact, impact factors have a lot of problems. All journal editors are keenly interested in the impact factor. Our impact factor has increased recently, but so have a lot of other journals. And for me, I think my life would be so much happier if I didn't have to worry about impact factors. The problem with them is, as a diagnostic or a tool, they are open to abuse. And they're, you know, I guess those that create the factors are trying to counter this abuse, but I think there are journal editors who will try and play games, and it's just not the reason that we want to do the job. Now, another thing that a lot of authors will do is look at journal quality lists. I think the best list I've ever seen, and I'm very biased because I had to run the list a few times in terms of its review, is the local Australian Business Deans list, so the ABDC, Australian Business Deans Council list. I imagine several of you in the audience are aware of this one, that you know about it. You can access it off the ABDC website. It was revised very recently, so it's updated. The Pacific-Basin Finance Journal is an A journal in the list, so there's only one higher category, an A star. There's also B journals and C journals. There are journals that aren't on the list, and largely they're not on the list either because they're irrelevant or because they are deemed to be predatory online journals. And for several iterations now, including the time that I was in charge of reviewing this list, as well as the most recent, there's been a big effort put into weeding out these dodgy journals. Now, there's a chance that there are still some journals in there that aren't or don't deserve to be there. So you need to be careful, but I'm confident most of the suspicious journals, the dodgy ones, are off the list. So a few more bits of advice on choosing the target journal. And it's a really important thing for you to consider, not just at the end. It's something you should consider very early on when you're conceiving a project. To me, it's really dumb to put it off and just think, that can come later. Because you can end up doing spending months of your life, sometimes years of your life, on a paper that you realise no journal's interested in, or maybe one, right? Occasionally in my career, I've come to the realisation at the end, I've been working on a paper with some collaborators where there's really only one journal that will be interested. And one I can remember in particular, the journal rejected it. So that was it. That paper died. So don't let yourselves get into those situations. So under normal circumstances, other things equal, choose high quality mainstream and generalist journals. All right, other things equal. Already talked about the ABDC list. Avoid journal arbitrage strategies. So if you look at a list, I've had colleagues do this. They say, I'm going to target an A journal. So they look at every A journal, and then it's almost like The only thing they care about is which is the easiest journal in that category to target. And to me, that's dumb. That's just, if you're tempted to do that, just sit back and ask yourself the question, why are you doing the research? Have a pecking order, and that will be largely guided by these journal lists, and have at least 3 journals in your target list on the assumption that you're probably going to be rejected at the first, and you go for the highest, the most challenging and ambitious one. I've already talked about fit. Think about where the key scholars are publishing. You want to be, there's possibly a reputation spillover by publishing in journals where the leading scholars are publishing. Balance aspiration with being ambitious but more realistic. So some of your work, okay, aspire and know that you're very likely to be rejected by the Journal of Finance. I've done that. I've never published in the Journal of Finance, never will, sadly. Aspiration is good, at least on some of your work, because if you're not too far off the mark, then the next level down of journal you will get published in. But don't do that for all your work, because you might have really bad luck and 3 years go by and you don't have publications. Really bad, particularly in a COVID environment, for your CV. So have some that you're a little less ambitious, more realistic, but not so realistic that you like that colleague I talked about much earlier, where I said they'd never been rejected. So if you're never being rejected, there's something wrong. Avoid predatory journals. Other things equal, go for journals that are in the reputable publisher range. So Elsevier, Wiley, Emerald, Sage, and there's a few others. That's not exhaustive. Do not abuse journal service. So don't target a high quality journal to harvest quality feedback. The journal editors are very clever. They know, they can smell. That'd be one of the reasons for a desk reject. So they get a paper in, they think, don't like it, it's got no chance, and these authors don't believe they're going to get in this journal. The only reason they're sending it to me, my journal's tier 1, they'll get a good review and that will help them revise it for the next round. That's a bad strategy. Take into account your local incentives. We all have local incentives. What I mean there is the incentive structure that's been set up at your university. And right now, there's a lot of flux. If I look at the University of Queensland, oh my goodness, it's really confusing. It's a state of flux, and it's not hard to be a little depressed, because understandably, all of the messages we're getting now is teaching is the most important, and research is far less important in stressful times. So research tends to be something that happens. It's like a luxury good, right? And in times when luxury goods are low, research tends to be a little low as well. In terms of the 21st century, try, as much as you can, conduct your research ethically. And there's the Committee on Publication Ethics gives a lot of guidance there. And linked to that is responsible science. So one of my, if I'm not giving webinars on pitching research, and I'm not giving webinars as I am today on how to get published, my favourite topic is to talk about responsible science. And that could be one, that we could run for this group in the next coming, wouldn't say weeks, but months. I'd be happy to talk about responsible science. It's a big and important topic. It's very complex, and it's something that researchers should be wary of, particularly in the 21st century, because technology will catch up with you. And it's not like everyone's trying to cheat, intentionally cheat. There's a minority of cases where there's cheating, or at least hardcore cheating, fraud, etc. Falsifying data results. But there's much more subtle things that can take place where we don't actually realise it, and it still comes under the banner of responsible science. So it's a really big area, and related to its replications. So I'd be happy to talk about that at another time. So very quickly, and then I will open it up to questions. In terms of execution, so how you go about executing a study, as I've already anticipated, I think in the companion session that will follow mine, you'll get some really good advice on this, but let me just maybe either give a little bit of an entree to that or add some other things. One of the obvious choices for us as researchers, particularly when we're starting out, is to do studies that are based in our home country. So where we were born, where we live, where we study, you name it. So for me, a lot of my early research chose Australia. Said, okay, I need to understand how Australia works. Getting the data is, more easy than other data and samples. It's going to be easier to sell to my local journal, so if I'm not too ambitious, etc., etc. Now, if we strive to get our work into international journals, be ready for the journal to come back and, or the referee to come back and say, why did you choose that setting? So I've had these reports. Why did you choose Australia? And usually they either say explicitly or implicit is, you should have chosen the US, all right? Why the US? Because for developed big markets, you're going to get the highest quality data, big samples. So one reason you choose non-US is if you've got a really interesting study that cannot be done in the US. So the data doesn't exist, or the limitations of data, or whatever. It's not very likely, but it is possible. And you'll see some of the non-US studies that are published in Journal of Finance or JFE or Review of Financial Studies. If you're a finance researcher, they are the top three, and those non-US studies will have a compelling case of not only an interesting and engaging question, but that it couldn't be done in the US. Now, for those of us that want our work in maybe not the Journal of Finance, but even the next tier down, we've got to make a really compelling motivation for why we chose that setting. And a referee will have in the back of their mind, if they get my paper that uses Australian data, they'll think, this is an Australian researcher, they've chosen it because it's natural for them, and they haven't given a good reason. Why? What's the academic reason? I don't care about the personal reasons. They're not, what you personally think is irrelevant. Your personal views are irrelevant. It's all around the academic side. So in terms of scope, which is the second dot point, you need to optimize. So you can be criticised for having too narrow a scope or too broad a scope. So you want to get the right scope, so you drill deeply enough to get an answer to the question, which hopefully is around causality. And a lot of the points I'll sort of raise here, and I think this will be a great entree to the session that will follow, is particularly the high quality international journals. The referees, the editors, they don't want to know about correlation. They want to know about evidence that will fairly strongly point to reliable causal inferences. So they'll want some information, compelling information around identification, around why there's not an endogeneity problem. How did you address the endogeneity problem? Is there an exogenous shock? Is there a natural experiment? So on and so forth. So these are the contemporary research design choices that we all should strive to get ourselves in the middle of. So you don't want to write a paper where you're using redundant or outdated techniques. So don't be labelled as a 20th century researcher living in the 21st century. Don't be labelled as a dinosaur. So these are very challenging things. So you will have robustness tests and sensitivity analysis. Some of that might be around, or you can couch in terms of one of the endogeneity challenges is measurement error. So if you can show using a battery of different alternatives for the dependent variable, the independent variables, maybe some of the control variables, the result is very strong and robust, that might be part of your combat or rebuttal of a measurement error challenge around that would lead to endogeneity and someone saying, well, I don't believe your results. You're just showing me a correlation. It's not necessarily causation. Data quality, veracity is important. If we use the tried and true sources of data, this is less relevant. If we go to new data sets or new settings, it becomes very much more relevant. Economic significance, the second last dot point. Often we get very preoccupied by statistical significance. And one of the big reasons is we know journal editors, and I think this is a sad reflection of reality. Hopefully there'll be a change, but journal editors and referees don't want to know about insignificant results. They only want to know about significant results, statistically significant. But as a referee, and many referees will be like me, I will push if I don't see the authors telling me, well, what's the economic magnitude of these statistically significant results? If the economic magnitude is tiny, then I'm going to say, so what? Now, sometimes it can be too large. So there needs to be a sanity check. Sometimes you'll say, oh, the economic magnitude dwarfs anything else in the literature around other potential explanations. Do I believe that? Probably not. In terms of writing craft, I've sort of hinted at this somewhat, but you should go professionally and polished. There should be style consistency. There should be connectivity in terms of the way you unfold a paper. It needs to be interesting. The length needs to be about right. You can make a mistake if it's too short, it's too long. Focused writing, a balanced style. Now, English is a second language, or at least if you're not a natural English speaker, all the big journals that I'm aware of are in the English language, and I know probably almost every single person in this webinar, English will be your second, maybe even your third language. And I don't know what, in a way I don't know what to say, but it's something that's very relevant and challenging to you, and you have to make sure you come up with strategies like collaborating with a good English native speaker that does more than just proofread your work. So they have to be interested in the research, they have to contribute in other ways. But professional editing is another way around this. It can be quite expensive, but professional editing by native English speakers will be absolutely important. And finally, here's some things to avoid. So I've seen many papers that immediately I've already started off negative, and then it seems to me like as I read through the paper, it's like I'm reading a diary of the research, almost like on day one I did, on day two I then did, on day three then I did this. Now, it's not literally that, but there's nothing more boring and off-putting if that's the way a paper's written up. Now, the notes that you have that would allow you your very first draft, sure. Don't submit that as your final submission to the journal. And you're not writing a mystery novel. So as I said almost right at the beginning of today's webinar, academic readers they want the spoilers. They want the spoilers at the beginning. They don't want to have to go to a final page to figure out what you're doing. So you're not writing fiction work. So the final thing I'm going to leave you with is repetition. This is another annoying thing that happens with bad writing. So I remember many years ago, I got a reviewer report, and one of the things the reviewer said, and I think they were a bit harsh, but it stuck in my mind. They said, say it once and say it well. Say it once and say it well. Now, it's not literally, you shouldn't take it too literally, because if we literally, on some things, we only say them once, there'll be a disconnect in the way you're writing. So there does need to be some overlap and some subtle linkage between what we're writing, but not so it seems like on every page you're repeating yourself over and over again. That's a really bad strategy. So I think with that's pretty much covered it. We should have some time for some questions, but I hope you found that helpful, interesting, and I will now, I guess, Eddy, you might have access to those written questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much for detailed and very, very beneficial information for all the participants. And I could imagine how how thorough the editing process would be, as I myself was the editor-in-chief of a journal, the Journal of Indonesian Economy and Business, some years ago. And what you have mentioned and also explained is really the rigorous process that we have to go through all the time. So thank you for that. And I think we've got a lot of information and there's some questions. So we have some time until about 10. So I'll take the first question here from Raditya Sukmana. How do you see, what do you think about the prestige of multidisciplinary journals? I think that's the first question to you.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And I think it's clear that I've taken a very discipline-specific approach to the topic at hand, and I think that's not unusual. That's perhaps some would say, dinosaur, 20th century, 19th century, whatever. And I think to an extent that's a fair call. That as we go forward with research, there's going to be greater demands on us to do multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. Really tough to do that. Because, one of the problems is I don't know how many journals there are, particularly those that would be seen as sufficiently high quality, as good destinations for publishing this type of work. Maybe there are. I'm a bit ignorant of that, and I apologise. I think the point I would make, and I think there will be a change in going forward, that more of this type of study will be required and valued, because there's a growing belief that we need to have more relevant research. And one of it's sort of related to responsible science that I was talking about, although I would, in that talk, emphasize more the reliability of research as opposed to its relevance. Not because I don't believe relevance is important, it's just I have less to say about that and it's more challenging. But I think until the world changes dramatically in that regard, my advice to most people is, when you start your career, you have to build on a firm foundation of discipline, strength and specialisation. So if you're interested in multidisciplinary, don't try and do it too soon. Unless somehow you're in a department or environment where, you know, if it's the Department of Multidisciplinary Research or whatever, I doubt that such a thing exists, then you don't have much choice. But if you're in a Department of Finance or a Department of Accounting or a Department of Psychology, Department of Management, whatever it is, and you're starting out, then for goodness sakes, give a higher value and premium to getting your creds, your credibility in your area of speciality. It seems to me, unless you've got that, you're not going to be able to participate in and contribute in a meaningful way to an multidisciplinary team. So I would think the more successful papers bring together different disciplines around a big, a challenging problem, and each specialist then brings their expertise to come up with a comprehensive, or as comprehensive as possible, answer to that question, to that wicked problem, if you like. So if you're interested in multidisciplinary, I'd say, the advice I'd give is build your specialisation first, and then be very cautious and careful of how you attack the multidisciplinary. And certainly I wouldn't try and do it by yourself or in a small team. Try and form a big team of discipline-based experts.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, I fully agree with that. So specialization first, and then you can think about some like wider or multidisciplinary journal, something like that. So I don't mean to skip the second question by Danny Purnomo, but I think it has been elaborated on by Robert about predatory journals, that always accept whatever submissions you give, and there's no thorough process of editing or even reviewing. So I think it's pretty clear. So I'll continue with the next one by Junaid Rana. So I think
actually I can read. Yeah, I can see.
Yeah,
sorry, I can read. Let me.
That's right.
Struggling with paper published, focusing.
Mm-hmm.
So
should he resubmit to maybe a lower level journal, or should he abandon it altogether?
It's a good question. It's a tricky one. I think it depends on the context. Like, if on the assumption that you've got a bit of a portfolio of papers, and really, if you don't have a portfolio of papers, because one reason for that is a strategy of a pipeline of research. So we don't want to be a researcher that just works on one thing at a time. And I know, so please, Junaid, don't misunderstand. I'm not accusing you of that, but I think it needs to be stressed so that I can give not only you a good answer, but for others that might be in a similar situation. That as one of a portfolio, I could see circumstances where you might just give up on it, or totally, or you might give up on it as a product in its own right, but think of, well, how can you, it's almost like the phoenix that rises from the ashes. So what parts of that paper, given the feedback you've got, that would allow you to pivot it in a way that you create a new paper that's going to have much better chance of success at a Q2 or Q1 or whatever. I would certainly give up on it if you felt you're so discouraged, it's a negative weight around your neck, and you just can't, I've had papers where I've given up. I just can't look at them anymore. Usually you have a lot of bad luck. I'm suspecting you've had quite a bit of bad luck here as well. And sadly, luck comes into it. So you might just say, I want to, I've got other things. You don't want to devote too much or over-invest in something that just doesn't seem to work. So you might be willing to give it a little bit more of an effort at another Q3 or whatever, but if you feel like you're so disheartened, you either just devote your energy into some, positive energy into new projects, or it could be that you take some elements of that rejected paper and pivot it to something that might have a better chance.
That's right. Thank you, Robert. I mean, he could learn from the reviews given by previous reviewers or editors and could build on that, I think, for improving the paper before sending it out to another journal, maybe. The next question is a quick question from Stephanie. So what are the differences in topics between finance journals and financial accounting journals?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's a quick question, but I sort of feel like I'm going to try and answer it as quickly as I can, but it's sort of, it's a deceptively simple, but it could give a long answer. So I'm going to try and attack this in a couple of ways. So one is to think of, and this is my personal perspective, and Stephanie, you might disagree with what I'm about to say, but I'm sorry about that in advance. So in terms of the way of distinguishing, to me, is to think of how these two disciplines set themselves up in terms of, if you think of your favourite textbook, or all the theories that are developed, and just the core focus of the discipline. So let me start with accounting. So to me, accounting is about information, and it's about how you convey information. And okay, you might say, well, is the information useful or is it not useful? The information we typically think of, the main port of call with information is accounting statements. So I'm probably going to get the terminology wrong. I mean, I'm a trained accountant, but I've never practiced. But the income statement, the balance sheet, or the statement of position, or whatever they call it these days, cash flow statement. Is this information useful, and how is it used? Blah blah blah. So studies that look at information and that type of focus are clearly accounting. So when I mention earnings management, it's sort of like, do accountants play around with accruals or whatever so that they smooth earnings or whatever? To me, that's all about just the information. But then accounting research has gone beyond that in terms of looking at, analyst forecasts, management forecasts, and it will link to things that start sounding like finance. So is it value relevant? What are the impacts? How do investors react to it, etc.? So there's a grey area, and it transitions over to, in the mainstream of finance, it's the decision making of, I think I'll just go the sort of usual protocol, but it can go much beyond listed firms. But if we typically think of listed firms, so there's shareholders of listed firms, and managers are there to make decisions on their behalf so as to maximise value and to maximise share price. So here the focus is very much, information might be relevant to that, but it's not the core focus. Okay, it's not the core focus, and the focus is ultimately, what are the value implications? What's the wealth implications for shareholders and maybe other key stakeholders relevant to the organisation? Now, there might be a few steps removed, so we might look at the corporate finance decisions of the managers. Well, that's probably closer to the action. But then we think, well, in terms of valuation, we probably need an asset pricing model. We need cost of capital. And Stephanie might say, but accounting, there's lots of cost of capital stuff. But if you go and look at the cost of capital focus in the accounting journals, it's very much about what is the role of accounting in the cost of capital. And if you look at finance, they almost don't care about accounting. You know, it's just there as, you know, it might get in the way a bit, drivers that may or may not involve accounting. So there is a grey area in between, but the way of thinking of it is ultimately, is it telling me, and is the research telling me an answer that's relevant to a finance question, or is it telling me an answer to an accounting question? The accounting question is around the information, not just accounting information and how it's used. The finance question is everything about the valuation. That's my answer.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Yet, I think this question is quite relevant to many of us, because we also see some overlapping names like accounting and economics, or between accounting, economics, and also finance and something like that. So thank you for the explanation. I try to rephrase the next question. I think from an anonymous attendee, I think she wants to know if she's writing about like Indonesian capital market. Can she send the paper to like international journals or something like that, considering that the topic is quite specific about a country, especially a developing country like Indonesia?
Yeah, so it is possible, but it's a challenge. And so I tried to touch on this a bit already, but let me give you another little refresher and hopefully a couple of other angles. If for an international journal, there needs to be something compelling about why you've chosen, so, okay, Indonesian market. So usually we think about, well, is there some peculiarity around the regulatory setting, some of the regulatory rules, some difference in taxation that we don't see elsewhere, something that would unlock an analysis that's either very difficult in another market or impossible. Because the way you've got to view it is, an international journal is interested in evidence that will be generic and of relevance to an international audience. So if you have a study that chooses Indonesia, and it can be viewed as just, one choice out of 100, that might be a bit harsh, but you could have chosen Thailand, or you could have chosen Malaysia, or you could have chosen some of the other Asian countries, and it wouldn't really matter. It's going to be really tough. It's going to be super tough, because journals don't, an editor doesn't want to feel like I've got to publish the same paper, 10 times over for each of the settings. So one way of thinking how it might be more compelling is if the setting you've chosen, and I understand why Indonesia would be your choice here, does that setting in a meaningful way feed into the hypothesis that you've got? All right, so if the hypothesis ends up very generic, someone, a critical reader would just say, you could look at that in any market. And so Indonesia wouldn't be the highest on my list of choices. If, however, the hypothesis is quite specific to the Indonesian setting, but in a meaningful way, because it might be quite specific, but what someone might say, and it would seem quite harsh for this reaction, well, yeah, the hypothesis is super relevant to Indonesia, but as an international reader, I don't learn anything new. And that's super tough. That's tough medicine. So it is possible, but you have to have these elements. They have to be the elements that would convince a reader that's wearing the hat of an international audience that we're going to learn something from this setting.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe regional data might be more helpful. I mean, to enlarge the scope of the data and the research hypothesis. Yeah. Thank you. So I get the next one here by Junaid again. Junaid, I think it's quite quite an interesting question about similarity index. Yeah. So how is it, influencing the desk evaluation by an editor at the similarity index?
I think
maybe
for
of
many,
a paper.
many editors, it would be one of the big ones that they would look at. So, running a paper through Turnitin or some other software. And, the software needs to, or the output needs to be carefully interpreted, because you can have situations where the similarity percentage is relatively high, but it can be explained by, the references are, just the common ones and so on and so forth. But clearly, plagiarism of some shape or form, whether it's outright plagiarism or self-plagiarism, is quite possible as well. There's no hard and fast answer to what level of similarity would trigger, but I would say to you that every editor would have that on their radar, and whatever their percentage is, if you go over that percentage, pretty sure you're going to get desk rejected.
Okay, thank you. Well, I don't mean to skip ahead Junaid's question, but he has a lot of excellent questions. But maybe I will give a chance to Muhammad Hashib. So he's wondering, he has observed that some papers in the introductory part, start with very straightforward statements, straightforward information, and so forth. But some other papers are more or are less straightforward by explaining, maybe the background information and also connections to previous studies or some other stories. So he's asking as to whether it's better to do the straightforward way or less straightforward, or how is the best method for a beginner?
Yeah, probably, a lot of, I think if I think of, say, the Journal of Finance, my guess is the very first paragraph, if I had to label it as what it's likely to be, having seen the paper, just guess, it'll be a motivation paragraph. So it'll basically start to tell the reader, why is this area generally important? What do we generally know about this, what's the general knowledge base in this area? And then start to and say, but here are some things that not only we don't know, having just told you what we do know, here is something that we don't know and we need to know. So that's likely, at a Journal of Finance level, that would be my guess of what that first paragraph and even the first few paragraphs are about. I'm not sure I'd give that, it might seem strange, but that I'd give advice for us to start papers off, particularly early on in your writing career. I think a better strategy for that first paragraph is to almost use, I'm going to give you the first 3 or 4 words of the opening paragraph, which is, in this paper, we or I, depending on whether it's multi-authored or single-authored, in this paper, and you basically tell the reader immediately what you're doing. It's probably still going to have a motivation flavour to it, that first paragraph. But see, readers want to know what you have done and what your paper's about. They don't want to be bored, even in the, and the worst place to start boring them is in the introduction, where you start talking about all the literature too generally, and they're sort of thinking, why are you telling me this? So my advice is try and get into the habit of writing that first paragraph with the first 4 words, in this paper, and then say what you do. But then blend it into starting to give the motivation for your paper.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. So I'll take 2 more questions for this session. But the next question by Ananto Prabhu, I think should be directed to Professor Law. It's about econometrics, about endogeneity. So I will leave this one out for now. The next one is very interesting. From an anonymous attendee again. I think but it seems that she's a PhD student from UPM, is a student of Professor Law. So she needs to publish like 2 papers before graduation as part of the regulation, I think. And she's wondering as to whether or how to balance between the fast publication process and also the quality that has to be attended to.
Good question. I think the short answer is you can't. There's no way. But that's a bit depressing and unhelpful. So obviously, so this is part of what I was mentioned earlier of the local incentives and the local rules. All right. So if you want my honest opinion, I think this idea of having to publish papers before students can get accepted is flawed. It's bad. And if that were the case at UQ, I would go and argue to the authorities. I'd probably lose, but I'd tell them, you're nuts. That's not going to help. That's not helping the anonymous attendee. That they're stuck. They're stuck with this dopey, stupid rule, and so it's thinking about, well, how do I deal with it? So trying to be a bit more constructive, the extent to which you can, I guess you play a bit of a game. So the extent to which within the thesis you can have you need 2 publications. So, I'll equate it to 2 chapters that you see as just doing the job of getting a publication in whatever level journal that meets the criteria, and don't overinvest in it. All right. If they want to have this dopey rule, then just deliver what's required there. Don't make it your best idea. This would be my honest and sincere advice. So in other chapters of your thesis where you do want the quality, reserve those for the length of time that makes sense. In our disciplines, it's not weeks, it's not months. You're going to need years, or at least a year or 2, and it will be beyond the time in which you want to be graduated as a PhD. So try and avoid giving your best ideas to some low-level journal just so you can graduate, and try and come up with a compromise that you have some chapters that have less ambition about them, and the goal, be very clear in your head, and as long as your supervisor sort of comes on board and agrees, the goal for these chapters is to get the publications I need.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I had a painstaking experience when I took my doctorate program. It took me 5 years to finish because of that. But I saw some of my colleagues who went to like the University of Georgia or some better tier schools that spent like 6.5 years just to fulfill that requirement. It's crazy. Thank you. So last question for this session from one moment. Hastuti Widyaningsi. So should we send maybe a particular paper to a conference or some conferences before submitting it to a journal? It's a typical question. Conference first and then submission, or how?
Look, I think every single academic will give you very similar advice on this. And that is get as much feedback as you can before sending to a journal. So if conferences, good conferences in your field where you've got either personal experience that if there's discussants, the discussants on average are very committed and give good feedback. I mean, you can be unlucky, but there may be, if you've got good experience, that those in the audience might come and talk to you later and give you advice. Most senior researchers would give the advice, more feedback is better than less feedback. More opportunities for getting feedback is always going to be better than less opportunities for getting feedback. In the end, you've got to make a call in terms of enough is enough, time might run out, COVID might prevent you from getting all the opportunities that you would like, although in current environment, maybe perversely you're getting more opportunities because the online version makes it more viable for you to engage in different conferences, subject you're getting accepted, papers accepted for the conferences. Certainly getting personal feedback from those trusted academics around you, senior academics in particular. If you have trust issues, and sometimes we do, you've got to overcome them somehow. In the end, success in all areas of our life requires. My pleasure. If I could quickly say thank you. I really enjoyed it. I'm happy to continue engaging with you on your side. I've already given a suggestion on another talk around responsible science. I don't think we need to do that in 2 weeks, but if you're interested, maybe we can talk about that for something later in the year or next year. But really enjoyed it. My apologies. I've got to go and teach now, so I'm going to have to sign out. So I'm really sorry. I feel very guilty. You've Prof. Siong, you've stayed on. You've endured my torture, and I'm not reciprocating. But I know you're going to do a great job, and I wish everyone well in the second session. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, again. And
okay, stay in touch.
See you on the next occasion. Yeah, see you.
Yep.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. I have to leave also. And see you, Pak Mamdu, and then Professor Law and Usman, everyone, Muizuddin, who else here on the panelist group. Thank you. See you all.